In 1986, rare historical document collector and researcher Mark Hoffman stood trial for the gruesome double bombings and homicides of Latter-day Saints members Kathy Sheets and Stephen Fred Christensen. Mark was accused of murder and fraud, yet today he is also known as one of the most notorious forgers in history. How did this event of the Utah bombings come to be? How did the lives of Mark Hoffman, Kathy Sheets, and Stephen Fred Christensen become intertwined? Well, let's start with the accused, Mark, and how without his murderous ego, there would be no need for this Netflix documentary, nor bombings to occur, and most importantly, Kathy and Stephen would still be alive today. 1985 was a year like every other for the world. Great ups and horrible and detrimental downs that would change the lives of the individuals and civilizations positively and negatively affected by these events. Standing a staggering 6'6" at the young age of 21, basketball player Michael Jordan is named as the NBA's Rookie of the Year.
Chicago with possession. Nice cross-court feed. Jordan going in, throws it up. He puts it in on an amazing move. There's great defensive effort by Jordan, who has it on the break. Driving all the way in. He's got an unbelievable move. He put it in and it counts. Can you believe that?
Also in that year of 1985, there was the first, now controversial, Live Aid pop concerts in the cities of Philadelphia and London that allegedly raised a whopping $50 million for famine relief for the East African country of Ethiopia.
Lest we forget while we're here, I'd like to introduce a video made by CBC Television. The subject speaks for itself. Thank you. Good night. Please send your money in.
Route 66, that was infamous of being the main highway that crossed multiple states within the U.S., is removed from the United States highway system. As previously stated, there were a multitude of events that affected the lives of people living in 1985. And going back to that year, the film I will be discussing today with all of you happened in the city that was called the Crossroads of the West, better known as Salt Lake City, Utah. Selfishness, narcissism, and secrets within the self-proclaimed Mormon city of Salt Lake took a turn for the worst in 1985 when the people in the Mormon church were shaken by what is now known as the Utah bombings. 2 innocent people lost their lives, and the religious people and their faith were deeply affected and therefore changed forever. Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 1, Part 1 on my new channel and podcast, It Girl in Crime, Murder, and Mystery, where I discuss in detail documentaries, film reenactments, and short content minis that encompass a topic of crime, murder, or mystery in each chapter. The film or content discussed will always be referenced and also linked in the description when necessary. The referenced content can typically be seen or heard on easily accessible streaming services or social media platforms that inform us, the viewer, of catastrophic and unimaginable events that took place in our past. Now, before we dive into the detail of this case, I implore you, if you have the want or the time, to watch this 3-part series, Murder Amongst Mormons, on Netflix before starting this chapter with me. Now, before I recount the specifics of this documentary, Murder Amongst Mormons, we must discuss the theme of this film, that being the Mormon religion and its history in Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, before I go on, hit that follow button and come along this journey with me. Let's begin. Now, if you didn't know, Mormons are what members are called that frequent the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There are, as of today, over a dozen faiths, beliefs, and clans that have since broken out from their original Mormon faith. So I will go to the beginning of their history and inform directly from the website churchofjesuschrist.org. And I quote, After the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the death of his apostles, and faced with organized persecution and hostility within the pagan Roman Empire, the church that Christ had established, with its simple but beautiful doctrines and authority, began rapidly to change. By the 4th century, it bore little resemblance to the original Church of Christ. With the loss of divine approval and authority from the church, a long period of spiritual darkness followed. End quote. Now, in the spring of 1820, a 14-year-old boy named Joseph Smith Jr. was praying in a wooded grove near his family farm in Palmyra, New York. This is when God appeared to him in all of his glory and setting in motion the events that led to the restoration of the ancient Church of Jesus Christ to the earth. God gave instructions to Joseph as not joining any of the current churches and was told, and I quote, that God would restore to earth the church originally organized by Jesus Christ with all of its truths and priesthood authority. Now, this is very important information, and I will quote again directly from the churchofjesuschrist.org newsroom. It says, and I quote, in September of 1823, Joseph experienced a visitation from an ancient prophet, a man who had lived and died in the hemisphere centuries earlier. This resurrected man, who said his name was Moroni, directed Joseph to a hill near Palmyra, where he showed him a religious history of an ancient American civilization engraved on metal plates and buried in the ground. It was 4 years before Joseph was permitted to take the record and translate it. It is known today as the Book of Mormon, named for one of the ancient prophets who had compiled it. The Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ, was first published in 1830. The Book of Mormon contains religious writings of civilizations in ancient America between about 2200 BC and AD 421. It includes an eyewitness account of the ministry of Jesus Christ on the American continent following his resurrection in Jerusalem. End quote. I know it was a long quote, guys, sorry. So after abiding God's words to him, 10 years later, after many visions, visits, and revelations from God, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was officially organized on the 6th of April, 1830 in Fayette, New York, thanks to Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet. Truly, this is a day long to be remembered, a day in which the God of heaven has begun to restore the ancient order of his kingdom to bring about the completion of the fulfillment of the gospel, to prepare the earth for the return of his glory. Joseph Smith. Now we're going into the history of Salt Lake City as we just finish the history of the modern day Mormon religion. They're intertwined, and you'll see that in this next chapter when I go it'll be about 2 minutes of me discussing Salt Lake City and its history and how it was settled and who was there before the settlers. So Salt Lake City is within the state of Utah, the state that compiles of one of many within the western region of the United States. And the northern central area of Utah lies the capital and most populous city of Utah, Salt Lake City. And here's a bit of information and history about who was there originally and how it became to be in the present. Since the beginning of civilizations, the state now known as Utah was inhabited by various Native American groups. The ancient Pueblo people, also known as the Anasazi, amassed large communities in southern Utah from roughly the year 1 to 1300 AD. The Ute tribe, from which the state takes its name, and the Navajo Indians arrived later in this region. Salt Lake City was established on July 24, 1847 by a group of Mormon migrants after fleeing west looking for asylum and to get away from religious hostility. The migrants, led by Brigham Young, who was Joseph Smith Jr.'s successor. Also, he was the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and later Young was the first governor of the Utah Territory. They were the first non-natives to settle permanently in the Salt Lake Valley. The Mormon migrants numbered 148 that consisted of 143 men and 3 women and 2 children. Side note, let me repeat that, 143 men and 3 women. Now, with all of these men settling in newfound territory, how do you believe these settlers were able to repress themselves sexually? With no available Mormon wives around or to marry. This is speculation and on my end, and everyone is human. And if plural marriage was still up to debate within the church, then in that small group, we could infer that same-sex relations were very common, along with relations consensually and non-consensually with Native men and women. I know we like to think the best of people and hoping they do not stray away, but realistically, same-sex relations and relations with natives were very common in early settler days, as there were no plethora of options. And also, abstinence was not inherently enforced on men in general in those times. Mormon or not, actually. I am not stating this as fact, but possibility and probability in that era. Whether we believe right or wrong, we can't condemn actions of sexuality when they are speculatory on my end at best. Okay, now that side note rant is done, let's get back to the history. When the Mormons first arrived in the valley, the region was a part of present country Mexico. But a treaty signed in 1848 transferred it to the United States, and in 1850, the state of Deseret became the Utah Territory. For everyone's information, Deseret means honeybee, a symbol of industriousness, and every state in the U.S. has a symbol or icon. Therefore, Utah's state symbol is the beehive. Okay guys, now that we're back, the film Murder Amongst Mormons that we will be discussing and talking about today was created by some familiar names. Now this is a backstory of the film, but I wanted you to know, like the directors Jared Hess and Tyler Measom, whom Jared co-wrote Napoleon Dynamite and Nacho Libre while simultaneously directing both films. And Tyler has a catalog of co-directing documentaries such as Sons of Perdition and An Honest Liar. Jared and Tyler have a connection to today's documentary because they were both raised as Mormons. And lastly, but not least, one of the executive producers who has a catalog that dates back to the early 90s, most notably from the documentary Paradise Lost trilogy series about the West Memphis 3 murders. The EP today is none other than Joe Berlinger. Now, if you don't know who Joe Berlinger is, he's a very important figure within true crime. If you've seen like Crime Weekly podcast with Stephanie and Mr. Lavasser, they went into detail. Stephanie did an amazing job. I think she did an 8-part series. It ended a few weeks ago where they discussed the West Memphis 3 and how the 3 boys, well now men, who were convicted should not have been convicted at all, and like they really should have consulted with others and not tried to put evidence upon the 3 men that were originally convicted. So that's West Memphis 3. If you haven't heard of it, haven't seen anything about it, I definitely recommend going to Crime Weekly and just going on their playlist of West Memphis 3 and just listening and learning. It's about like probably 10 hours long, the whole series, but definitely worth it. It's very informative, and it just opens your eyes to people who are wrongly convicted without proof. Okay, now that I did my Joe Berlinger rant, we have the people behind the camera, and now we can dive into this documentary, Murder Amongst Mormons, on Netflix. Mark Hoffman, born Mark William Hoffman, was the second and only son of Lucille Lune Sears and William Hoffman. Mark was born on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7, 1954, in Salt Lake City, Utah. His childhood was very peculiar and was layered with unusual circumstances. As a kid, Mark was not an extraordinary academic. He was below average when it came to school, but he had interesting side hobbies such as magic, electronics, chemistry, and stamp and coin collecting. It is also alleged that Mark and his friends were said to have made bombs for fun on the outskirts of Moray, Utah. Allegedly, when Mark was about 12 years of age, he began collecting coins and altering them so other collectors will find them more valuable. And also at age 14, he invents a forgery technique he believes is undetectable. But also around this age of 14, he clashed with his religion and lost his faith in the church due to his grandparents kind of being rebellious when he came to learn that his maternal grandparents had continued secretly practicing polygamy for more than a decade after the church publicly ended the practice. It was not fully renounced until 1904, though. Side note, with that 1904 renouncing, and food for thought, since we are talking about his mom's parents, they would have been brought up well before or shortly after their renouncement in 1904. So they were accustomed to that way probably from the older Mormons surrounding them when the grandparents were young and impressionable. Now, I have no fight in the game of polygamy. Adults that give knowledgeable consent to other adults is none of my business, or anyone's for that matter. I just don't care. It wasn't his parents who were raising him to be this way, but his maternal grandparents, who I'm sure he really didn't see that often, even if he did. So I think Mark is just using this as an excuse to why he lost his faith instead of just blaming it on not really either believing in it or he cared more about his genius ego of fooling people as a teen more than keeping his faith. Now back to it. As an older teen in 1973, when Mark was 19, he was of age to go on missions. Now, missions for the LDS faith is when a period of volunteer service, usually ranging from 6 to 24 months, when church members devote themselves part-time or full-time to proselytizing, humanitarian assistance, or other service, as quoted from the church official website. Now, Mark, for his mission, was sent to Bristol, England. This was his chance to explore more history within the Mormon faith and to branch out for once and try to find hard-to-find collectibles within the Mormon religion and also controversial Mormon texts that would strengthen his belief that Mormonism as a whole was based off of lies. Now, you guys, within this documentary, if you haven't seen it, it does in episode 1 make it feel like Mark Hoffman is more of a martyr, kind of, even though he didn't die for like any reason, he's still alive. But it made it feel like he was more of a martyr between the interviews of close confidants and all. It is just a very weird precedent to make within that first episode because it shows him to be a likable person that everyone seemed to like and trusted to be around. No one had any clue anything was off at the time. And I found that this was fine until you realize in episode 2 that he probably is the assailant. Due to the editing of this documentary, for me at least, you don't end up continuing on the limited series feeling horrible for the victims and their families and friends affected only, but you also don't end up seeing Hoffman as this murderous, demented, insane psycho like we would when we think of Ted Bundy. It's quite interesting that they took that route because in the end, due to religious terrorism, Mark Hoffman ended up being a bad guy that you somewhat understood. And that's how it was edited on this 3-part series, which I found very uncomfortable. And you also didn't feel too bad for him. Now, if that's what the creative team, Jared Hess, Tyler Measom, and Joe Berlinger had as a goal while making this, I guess they accomplished it. But if not, then I don't know how we all got here. The film doesn't really tell us about how Mark and his now ex-wife, Dory Hoffman Olds, met, nor how really any of his friends at that time met. It was a very brushed over topic that I'm certain the producers just didn't have enough time to go into. If we were told in detail how each person met, then we'd have a better understanding of their personal relationship with Mark. It just felt very fast and edited that I just didn't know who those 20 people who were interviewed were. The only way you can see why this is important and why I'm making a point to bring this up is watching the documentary. And you can see the vibe of some of the close confidants of Mark's. And I say close confidants lightly because let the cast tell it, they just did business with Mark. and knew of him from other collectors but weren't close to him or his dealings. The only one that didn't shy away from saying they were close friends was a man by the name of Shannon Flynn, that was also a rare document collector and follower of the Mormon faith and researcher of its interesting history. Now, Shannon Flynn at the time was definitely Mark's right hand, to be quite frank, especially in the mid-80s when that situation in the bombings happened. They met by way of the small circle of Mormon collectors that were in the city of Salt Lake, whom all, one way or another, frequented Russ Coin and gift shops. Now, Russ Coin and gift shops was owned by a man named Al Rust, who was interested in Mormon religion and money items. Mark realized Al's interest and started frequenting his shop in order to sell renowned items to Al. That frequenting of the same bookstores and shops is in a way of how Shannon Flynn and Mark Hofmann met. And Shannon, how he spoke in the documentary, was obviously enamored and head over heels in a platonic way toward Mark. He described that Mark always was very secretive about his contacts and how he was always able to get the rarest of documents and collectibles and would allegedly keep that close to chest. And from what Shannon said, he didn't tell Shannon any of that. Now, with continuing on the documentary or 3-part series. Now, before we go forward about the case, the bombings, how it happened, where it happened, how people died, I wanted to take the time out to give the victims airtime. I found that in the 3-part series, Murder Amongst Mormons, they did not do the victims justice. They barely talked about them. I think altogether each person maybe got 5 minutes of actual screen time of talking about who they were, how like maybe their family was affected. But when it came to the victims, they only talked about area or the circle around the murder. That was the only time they seemed useful in that documentary. But for me, I want to take time out to talk about them, to shed light about who they were and how they positively impacted their Mormon communities and their families. In this documentary, that did not happen, sadly. It was solely about Mark Hofmann, and that's kind of why the energy and feeling while watching the film, you didn't feel necessarily that Mark was a horrible person. You know, that's kind of how they edited it, but like also that's just how everything was interviewed, how the old footage that they used, it just encompassed him as a man with a mission and not a man who's a murderer, if that makes sense. When it came to the documentary, I felt that it did not do the victims justice at all. The only time they got airtime is when they were talking about Mark and the murders, and they were more of a casualty of the film versus like victims and people who were horribly murdered. After seeing the photos of their death, it was horrific how they died. Like those bombings, those homemade bombings ripped through them, and seeing people in their final moments or past their final moments, it was just very stark and shocking that this man, Mark, who this film is about, essentially, not even the victims, it's not about the victims, it's about Mark, that he could do something like this. Because from what you see on the film and doing your own due diligence and going and finding these photos, it is just very shocking, because on the film they show him maybe as a martyr, as someone who, you know, was a man on the mission, who had reasons to do what he did. At the end, they tried to make it seem like he was crazy and tried to make it, you know, like, oh, he's just egotistical and like all this other jazz. But the feeling and energy of the beginning 2 episodes of that film, you just felt that they were trying to cast doubt or like question things about those murders. So those victims, Kathy Sheets and Stephen Fred Christensen. I have notes here just to tell you a bit about who they were, and also how Mark Hoffman would have known them. And like, was he aiming for them specifically? Or was he just putting bombs places and just expecting people to, die? Oh, before I go, I want to add that it was Kathy Sheets, Stephen Fred Christensen, and Mark Hoffman, the bomber, tried to kill himself, maybe. It was very gray on the film about if he was trying to kill himself or not. I was very confused. Towards the end on the third episode, they kept talking about his maybe ego and like his delusions. And so I have to believe that maybe he just wanted the attention and didn't really try to kill himself, but maybe tried to get the heat off of his back and showcase that he's a victim and also the survivor. Because no matter a religion, a faith, a people, a culture, everyone loves a survival story or the perfect victim. Which is a perfect victim is a dead victim, but still, a perfect victim, someone who survived and can tell that harrowing story of survival and how they stuck to the belief that they would be okay. As I said, I'm reading my notes to the side here, so don't judge me. I don't have everything memorized, and this is the best way so I get everything correctly about these victims. So I have about 5 points per victim, just so I can shed light, and I'll talk a bit more about them. So Stephen Fred Christensen was age 31 when he died, or when he was killed and murdered. He was a Salt Lake City financial consultant. So with that, as we know, Salt Lake City is Mormontown, encompasses Mormonism. So therefore, a financial consultant also deals with the Mormon Church, maybe their money and financial dealings within the Mormon Church. Because with history collecting and researching, the church has unlimited funds, especially the Mormon Church. So therefore, consultants such as Stephen Fred Christensen would be of very good use for the church. So he was definitely working with the church in an office in downtown Salt Lake City. Stephen also was a document collector. I found that, at least from the film, I'm not sure because I do not know any devout Mormons personally, but at least at that time, I'm not sure if it's still the same today, that Mormons were and are possibly very into their history and into finding out more information about early Mormon days and early settler days. I found that in the film, the 3-part series, that everyone who was interviewed had something to do with collecting coins, collecting data, researching, financial consulting with the church. They all had to do with the church, but also it was their own personal happiness to find out about the history, because the history is the truth, and it showcases that the Mormon faith is the right faith. Mormonism encompasses the end-all be-all for their history. So Mark was a document and coin collector, as everyone else kind of was, that he was involved with. So that connection for Stephen and Mark was more, Mark would get the documents, and maybe Stephen or one of the other financial consultants would be the third party. Instead of Mark going directly to the church, Mark would go to the financial consultant or meeting with the financial consultant, and he would sell his research or the coins or whatever historical documents for the Mormon Church that they felt were valuable, and he would sell them. So it was by leeway with the third party, who was either Stephen or someone else in the financial consulting within the Mormon Church and their offices. But not only that, but Stephen Fred Christensen was also the son of a locally prominent clothier, Mac Christensen. So they had kind of a family name for themselves within Salt Lake City, especially within the Mormon faith. Prominent families are always important, no matter if you're religious or not. Stephen, who had a middleman role in the church's purchase of authenticated documents. So as I said, Stephen was a third party. He was the middleman for the church. So Mark would go to him or someone else, another financial consultant, and that's how they did their dealings with the church instead of going to the church directly. It was too hard for that, and also the church wanted to make sure they had their hands clean, and they didn't really want people to know how much money they were actually offering or giving. So I think NDAs and like kind of contracts were signed so people couldn't really inform the public of how much the church was paying for these documents, in which financial consultants come into play. Stephen's death happened on October 15th, 1985. And on that day, Randy Rigby, his business partner, was supposed to meet at 8 a.m. at Judge Building, but he called Stephen to tell him he was running like 10 minutes late because he stopped to get documents. Then he arrived and the death already occurred after Rigby arrived. And so on the film, Rigby's giving kind of a play-by-play. He definitely has survivor's guilt because he was supposed to be there in the building doing a meeting. And he feels, well, you kind of see allegedly that Rigby feels that if he was there doing the meeting with Christensen, that Christensen would have been with him somewhere else during that meeting, and maybe Christensen wouldn't have passed or been bombed. And so I think Rigby definitely had survivor's guilt. He felt horrible about running late, in hindsight, of course. They definitely showed vintage footage when it came to news broadcasting and just police footage from that time in interviews, which was crazy to see. And you really saw the effects of what the bomb did in that office. Now, Stephen Fred Christensen was murdered by a packaged pipe bomb. So the packaged pipe bomb was delivered by the secretary. Someone dropped it off, before, back in like maybe the 80s and 90s, and prior probably. Secretaries had the job of also doing admin and giving each designated person their parcels and packages and things like that. With that, the secretary delivered the package at the Judge Building, and the police and everyone on the film kind of believed Christensen was a direct target. Actually, I agree with that because the package had a name on it, and it obviously had to have had Stephen Fred Christensen's name. Therefore, the package was delivered directly to the proper person. Does that make sense? The next victim was Kathy Sheets. Now, Kathy, at the day of the bombing, was 50 years of age, and she was the wife of Gary Sheets, who was a financial consultant, just like Christensen. So, as I said, I think Mark was targeting people that were the third person or the middleman for the church, the financial advisors, the people that can maybe tell that his documents were fake. So with Kathy Sheets, since she was the wife, we can infer that the bomb that Mark created in his house, the house bomb, was delivered by Mark to the house and had her husband's name on it. And from Mark's own words on the film, from his recordings, he says he really didn't care who was going to pick up that second bomb. He didn't care if it was a child, anyone. He just did not care. He just wanted the effect of killing someone and making a statement for the church. The bombings happened at Kathy Sheets and Gary Sheets' home at 4630 Naniloa Drive in Holiday. It's a suburb in Salt Lake City. She died instantly, just like Christensen. Kathy Sheets, she died instantly. The bomb was very effective. The bomb was placed on the wooden sidewalk. So I'll see if I can get footage or put in something where their house is so you can kind of see where the sidewalk, the wooden sidewalk will be and where the bomb was. The bomb for Kathy Sheets happened within the same hour of Stephen Fred Christensen's death. So first, Stephen got bombed and died. And then within that same hour, Kathy Sheets got bombed and died. Salt Lake City was rocked. I mean, I talked to my older family members, and it was on the news at the time in 1985, and they remember this. They said when I brought it up to them about this video idea, they said, "Oh my gosh, I remember that." And I told them a few details, and they were just telling me things back, and they remembered the Utah bombings. So it was a very impactful situation. It was a very dark moment for the state of Utah, but also all of America, because it was broadcasted everywhere because it was a Mormon bombing. Like, it was shocking. Now for the film, the 3-part series, they did not get any of Kathy Sheets or Stephen Fred Christensen's family. I'm not sure if they asked anyone in that family or anyone connected to the family to be interviewed, but if they did, maybe they said no. So therefore, I'm going to take the initiative and not talk about direct family members of the victims, because I'm not sure if they feel comfortable with that horrible stain and horrible trauma that they've experienced being blasted, along with their faces or their names or their stories, So I think if you want to know more about them, you can Google them, research them yourselves, the direct family members and the kids and the wives and direct family members and the kids and the spouses. But I personally won't be talking about them. Maybe they've moved on, maybe they've already passed, but that's kind of none of our business, and I'll like to respect that. Now that we talked about the 2 victims, and talk about a bit about who they were, kind of. I can't go into detail because, number one, people who are devout Mormons aren't really on social media usually, but also they don't really have their background blasted or who they were blasted, especially if they were born or alive before the social media and internet craze. So this was the 80s. Can't find much information about them out, so we can just leave it at that when it comes to the 2 victims. So thank you so much for watching Chapter 1, Part 1. Part 2 will be out next week. I'm trying to figure out a schedule of when I want my uploads to be so I can be consistent, because this took me ages of procrastination to even do. I'm happy I did it though. I'm happy I shed light to the victims. Thank you guys so much. This has been Chapter 1, Part 1. Chapter 1, Part 2 comes out next week at the same time. I'm trying to figure out my upload schedule. I'm not sure yet, but once I know, I'll definitely put that in the description below so you guys know for the future. Next week, we will definitely be discussing Mark Hofmann, how he tried to hurt, harm, and may possibly kill himself. And then also we'll go into detail about the trial, which is very important, and also the outcome of that trial and the effects it had on the Mormon faith. And lastly, we will talk about how the killings of Kathy and Steve affected the Mormon faith within Salt Lake City and also America. Very important. Part 2 is going to be the best part for sure. Part 1, this had to be more of a history moment, a learning moment, and an introductory for myself on how I wanted to do these podcasts, okay? So thank you guys so much. I know my accent's strange, you guys can't help it. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and also follow, like, and give me some good 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. All right? Thank you guys so much. Have a nice day.